Happiness was a bright and cheerful 6-year-old girl with sparkling eyes and a smile that could light up a room. But beneath her innocent exterior, a darkness loomed that no child could ever endure. It began when her uncle, her father's younger brother, moved into their small home. Her mother, always busy with her market errands, never imagined the monster she had unknowingly welcomed under their roof. Each morning, her mother would wake early, preparing to go to the market to buy goods. Happiness, desperate to escape the torment she faced daily, would tug at her mother's wrapper, pleading, "Mama, please take me with you." Her mother, tired and preoccupied, would shout, "Go back to sleep. It's still early, and the market is no place for a little girl." Her pleas always fell on deaf ears. As soon as her mother left, her uncle would emerge from his room, his face twisted with malice. His voice was cold, his presence menacing. He would corner Happiness, silencing her with threats that no 6-year-old could comprehend. "If you ever tell anyone," he hissed, holding her chin tightly, "I will use this," he said, showing her the cold black shape of a gun. "I will kill your mama and papa. I'll make sure you never see your mama or papa again." Terrified, Happiness could only nod, her small body trembling as she endured his wrath. "Go inside now and lay on the bed for me." Happiness lives in constant fear. She stopped playing with her friends, stopped smiling, and became a shadow of the happy child she once was. After her mother returned from the market, Happiness would hide at the back of the house, sitting alone with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the ground. She never told anyone about her bruises or the pain. Her uncle baked cake, made chin-chin, and gave her more than he would give other children. She was unhappy, yet no one noticed. She was always sad, hoping someone will just understand what she's going through, but no one does. She will sit at the back of the house and cry, and when anyone sees her and asks what the problem is, she would say nothing while she's going through a whole lot inside. For 2 years this cycle continued. Her mother, blinded by the routines of life, failed to notice the drastic change in her daughter. Happiness's once bright eyes became dull, and her laughter disappeared altogether. All her mother was concerned about is money and money, nothing else. You might want to ask where her father is. He's a very calm man. He's a fashion designer. He stays in the shop because they had a lot of customer clothes to make, and he comes home once a while. It wasn't until a nosy neighbor noticed something was wrong. "Your daughter always looks so sad these days," the neighbor said one evening. "Have you noticed? She doesn't play like other children anymore. Also look at the way she walks. Something is wrong. Check well." Her mother, initially dismissive, decided to check on Happiness that night. As her daughter slept, she gently lifted her blanket. They found the scars of torment, undeniable evidence of what she had been through. Shocked and horrified, the next day, a family meeting was called. Happiness, trembling with fear, was asked to explain what had happened. At first, she was too scared to speak, remembering him saying if she says anything, he would kill her father and mother. But with gentle coaxing, she began to recount the horrors she had endured. Her uncle denied everything, but the evidence was clear. Despite his admission, the family chose not to involve the authorities, fearing shame and scandal. Instead, her uncle was sent away, unpunished and free to continue his life elsewhere. For Happiness, the damage was already done. Though her abuser was gone, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. Her trust in adults was shattered, and she struggled to find joy in the world around her. Her mother never even tried to comfort her. The bond between them was never the same. Happiness carried the weight of her trauma silently, her name a cruel irony of the life she now led. After our uncle's betrayal, lots of other people tried to take advantage of her. How much she tells her mom she wouldn't believe her. Instead, she will call her prostitute. How then can the child come back to tell her mother what she's going through? Instead, she keeps everything inside. Her mother decided to circumcise her, thinking her sex drive was just too high as a child of 10 years old. Not realizing that she had never protected her child, she left her alone to navigate life by herself. As she grew older, Happiness learned to cope with her pain in silence. The brightness of her childhood had been stolen, leaving her to navigate a world that seems indifferent to her suffering. 5 years later, Happiness adjusted the tray of groundnuts on her head, carefully balancing it as she stood near the market gate. Her small bare feet had begun to blister from walking the dusty roads, and her eyes scanned the crowd for any familiar faces. The smell of fried plantain and grilled corn filled the air, but Happiness felt only hunger in her belly and a weight in her heart. Life had never been easy for Happiness. At 15, she had already seen more of life's challenges than most girls her age. She was the eldest child of 4 children, with 3 younger brothers, Chinedu, Ikenna, and Emeka. Every day felt like a new battle to survive. Her mother, Mama Happiness, was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut through a crowd of traders like a whip. A hard-working trader who sold yams and vegetables in the market, her focus had always been on one thing: money. She drilled this same value into her children: no money, no life. For as long as Happiness could remember, she and her brothers were always out on the streets, selling whatever they could. Some days it was groundnuts wrapped in paper cones. Other days they hawked oranges or sachets of cold water. Each morning before the sun even began to rise, Mama would shake them awake and send them to the streets to sell. "You think life is easy? Better get used to it now. You must suffer first if you want to succeed," Mama would say, her voice stern and unyielding. Their father, Papa Happiness, was the opposite, a gentle, easy-going man who worked as a tailor. Papa always had a soft smile for his children, but his softness came with little power in the house. Mama made the decisions, and Papa stayed out of the way, stitching clothes in his small shop by the roadside. Happiness always wished she could spend more time with him, but work kept them both busy, and there was no time for idle conversation. For Happiness, the greatest pain came from the silence around her struggles. Being the only girl, she carried the weight of responsibility, protecting and guiding her brothers while also navigating the confusion of adolescence. But the hardest part was that no one ever listened. No matter how much pain or confusion she felt, there was no one to turn to, no one except the moon. Every night when the world grew quiet, Happiness would slip outside the house and sit under the full moon, its light bathing her in silver. She liked to think of the moon as a friend, one that listened without judgment. In those moments, with the cool breeze on her skin and the crickets singing their nightly song, she would talk to the moon about everything: her fears, her frustrations, and the things she could never tell anyone else. "Do you know how it feels to be so alone?" she whispered one night, her voice cracking. "Do you know what it's like when nobody sees you?" The moon, of course, said nothing, but Happiness imagined it understood. It was the only place she could let her emotions spill freely, without fear of being scolded or ignored. Her mother was always too busy to notice her tears. The woman only cared about how many sachets of water Happiness had sold that day, or whether the groundnuts were finished. And Papa, though kind, never seemed to have the courage to stand up for her against Mama's sharp tongue. Her brothers, too, were often lost in their own world. Chinedu, the oldest of the boys, had become distant as he grew older, focused more on making friends in the neighborhood. Ikenna, the second, followed in Chinedu's footsteps, more interested in football than family. But Emeka, the third child, was different. At 12, Emeka was quiet and observant, always watching the world with a seriousness beyond his years. And unlike the others, he saw Happiness. He noticed when her eyes looked sad, or when she returned home with a bruised heart, hiding behind forced smiles. One evening, after a long day of hawking groundnuts, Happiness sat alone under the mango tree outside their house, the moon high above her. She rested her head on her knees, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her. Just as a tear slipped down her cheek, she heard a soft voice. "Sister, why are you crying?" Happiness looked up to see Emeka standing beside her, his small face full of concern. "It's nothing," she whispered, wiping her eyes quickly. Go inside, Emeka. But the boy crouched beside her, resting a hand on her arm. You always say it's nothing, he said quietly, but I know it's something. Happiness hesitated, feeling the familiar lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, how tired she was, how lost she felt, and how the men she encountered on the streets had taken advantage of her body, leaving her feeling broken and used. But how could she burden her little brother with such things? He was only a child. It's nothing, she whispered, wiping her eyes quickly. Go inside, Emeka. But the boy crouched beside her, resting a hand on her arm. You always say it's nothing, he said quietly, but I know it's something. Happiness hesitated, feeling the familiar lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, how tired she was, how lost she felt, and how the men she encountered on the streets had taken advantage of her body, leaving her feeling broken and used. But how could she burden her little brother with such things? He was only a child. Instead, she gave him a small smile and ruffled his hair. You're too smart for your age, Emeka, she said, her voice light despite the heaviness in her heart. Go inside before Mama comes and shouts. Emeka didn't argue, but before he left, he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You can always talk to me, you know, he said. I'll listen. And for the first time in a long while, Happiness felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Life continued in its relentless rhythm. Each day brought new challenges, new faces, and new disappointments. Happiness grew used to the harsh reality of the streets, the catcalls from men, the leering eyes, and the hands that brushed too close. She learned to smile through the discomfort, to laugh off the inappropriate comments, and to pretend everything was fine. But inside, the cracks in her heart deepened. There were days when she felt like a puppet, pulled in every direction with no control over her life. Mama wanted her to sell more, to bring in more money, while the streets demanded a different kind of payment, a piece of her dignity, bit by bit. And all the while, Papa sat in his shop, oblivious or unwilling to see the struggles his daughter faced. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult encounter with a man who had cornered her by a roadside stall, Happiness returned home feeling hollow. The man's words still echoed in her ears, his touch lingering on her skin like a stain she couldn't wash away. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tell someone, anyone, what she was going through. But she knew better. Mama wouldn't care. To her mother, as long as the money came in, everything else was irrelevant. That evening, Happiness found herself once again under the moon. This time, the tears came freely, spilling down her cheeks as she hugged her knees to her chest. Why me? She whispered to the moon, her voice barely audible. What did I do to deserve this? She stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in her own sorrow until she heard footsteps behind her. It was Emeka again, his small shadow blending with the night. He didn't say anything this time. Instead, he sat beside her, his presence a silent comfort. And for once, Happiness didn't feel quite so alone. Being the firstborn came with expectations that Happiness didn't ask for but had to carry. She was expected to act like a mother to her brothers, even when her own heart felt heavy with pain. When Emeka or Chinedu forgot their tasks or returned home with barely any sales, it was Happiness who took the blame. One morning, after the children had returned from selling sachets of water, Mama's sharp voice echoed through the compound. You sold only 2 packs today? Mama snapped, glaring at Happiness and her brothers. You think life is a joke, eh? If you don't bring enough money, will I go and beg in the streets? Happiness looked down, knowing it was useless to explain that the cold had made people less likely to buy water that day. I work from morning till night to feed all of you, and this is how you repay me? Mama's voice rose with every word. Lazy children, maybe I should stop feeding you, and then you'll learn. Happiness clenched her fists, anger bubbling under the surface. It wasn't fair. She wanted to scream, to tell Mama how tired she was, how hard it was to be a child and an adult at the same time. But she swallowed the words, knowing they would only lead to more scolding. Instead, she apologized, as she always did. Sorry, Mama. Tomorrow we'll sell more. Mama clicked her tongue in frustration and turned away. You better. If not, don't come home." It was in moments like these that happiness felt the heaviest burden, not just the weight of responsibility, but the crushing loneliness of knowing that no one saw how hard she tried. The streets were unforgiving, especially to a young girl. Happiness had learned this early. It started with innocent compliments from older men. "You've grown so beautiful, Happiness," but soon evolved into something more dangerous. Some men would offer to help her with sales, only to touch her in ways that made her skin crawl. Others would promise her small gifts in exchange for favors that left her feeling violated and ashamed. One day, after selling oranges in a neighboring market, she found herself cornered by a man she had seen several times before. He was well dressed, with smooth words that dripped like honey. "You're too fine to be suffering like this," he said, stepping closer. "I can take care of you, make your life easier." Happiness tried to step away, but he grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Don't act shy now," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "We're friends, aren't we?" Her heart pounded in her chest, panic rising like a wave. She wanted to run, to scream, but fear paralyzed her. In that moment, she felt small and powerless, trapped in a world that only took and never gave. When she finally managed to pull away and run home, tears streamed down her face. She knew she couldn't tell Mama. Her mother would only blame her for putting herself in such a situation. And Papa, he wouldn't understand. He would probably tell her to be careful and leave it at that. So once again, she kept the pain to herself, locking it away in the deepest part of her heart. That night, under the soft glow of the moon, Happiness sat on the worn wooden bench outside their house. Her chest felt heavy, and she knew that if she didn't let some of the weight out, it would suffocate her. Emeka appeared as if he had been waiting for her. He sat beside her without a word, his presence warm and familiar. For a long time they sat in silence, the sounds of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Then, without looking at him, Happiness spoke. "Do you ever feel like the whole world is against you?" she whispered. Emeka glanced at her, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I have you." The simplicity of his words made Happiness's throat tighten. For a moment she fought the urge to cry, but the tears came anyway, spilling over like a river breaking through a dam. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Emeka," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Every day, it feels like I'm drowning and no one even notices." Emeka placed a hand on her shoulder, his small fingers squeezing gently. "I notice," he said softly. And in that moment, Happiness felt a flicker of hope, small and fragile, but enough to remind her that she wasn't completely alone. Papa Happiness, despite his quiet nature, noticed more than his children gave him credit for. One evening, as Happiness sat in the corner of the small living room, sewing a torn school uniform, Papa walked over and sat beside her. "You've grown so much, my daughter," he said, his voice soft. "Too much, too soon." Happiness looked up, surprised. It wasn't often that Papa spoke about such things. "I know your mother is hard on you," he continued, "and I know life has not been easy." He paused as if searching for the right words. "But I want you to know that I see you. I see everything you do for your brothers, and I am proud of you." Happiness's eyes stung with tears, but she blinked them back. It wasn't much, but those words were a balm to her wounded heart. Happiness had been sick for weeks, her body betraying her with nausea and exhaustion. She knew something was wrong but refused to admit it to herself. However, deep down, she feared the truth, the late periods, the dizzy spells, the morning sickness. Eventually, when she couldn't avoid it any longer, she whispered the unthinkable to herself. She was pregnant. At first she tried to deny it. She told herself it would go away, that maybe it was just stress or fatigue from working so hard. But with each passing day, the truth became harder to ignore. Her stomach had started to harden slightly, and the weight of the growing life inside her felt like a curse she could not escape. She knew what her mother would say if she found out. "You're a disgrace," Mama would yell. "You think this is the time to be getting pregnant while we are barely surviving." The thought of Mama's anger paralyzed her with fear. There was no way she could keep the baby. She wasn't even sure which of the men from the street encounters had fathered the child. She had no one to help her, no one to lean on. That was when the plan began to form in her mind. She would get rid of the pregnancy, no matter what it took. Happiness lay awake one night, her thoughts racing. She knew of a man, one who was known in the neighborhood for helping girls in her situation. He wasn't a doctor, but for the right amount of money, he performed abortions quietly. The problem was that she had no money. Every naira she earned selling groundnuts went directly to her mother. In her desperation, she did something she never thought she would do. She stole from Mama. One morning when her mother was in the market, Happiness crept into the wooden box where Mama kept her daily earnings and took a handful of cash. The bills felt hot in her hand, like they were burning her skin with guilt. But she told herself it was the only way. If Mama found out she was pregnant, her punishment would be far worse than the consequences of stealing. With the stolen money clutched tightly in her hand, she made her way to the man's shack at the edge of the market. The man, a greasy middle-aged man with yellowing teeth, grinned when he saw her. "Ah, so you came," he said, his voice oily. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." But what followed was not what she had imagined. Instead of helping her, the man took advantage of her vulnerability, using her desperation as an opportunity to assault her. When it was over, she lay on the cold floor, her body aching and her soul shattered. "You can go now," the man said dismissively, waving her away like she was nothing. The abortion she had sought had not been done, and the money? He kept it, as though it were payment for the violence he had inflicted on her. Happiness stumbled back home, her legs weak and her heart heavy with shame. She felt broken in ways she couldn't even begin to describe, and worst of all, she still carried the child inside her. Back home, Happiness quietly returned what little money she had left from the stolen amount. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The damage was already done, and it was only a matter of time before her mother discovered everything. 3 months and 2 weeks into her pregnancy, her belly began to show, and there was no hiding it anymore. That evening, as Happiness was sweeping the compound, Mama's sharp eyes caught the slight bulge under her daughter's dress. "What's that?" Mama demanded, stepping closer. Happiness froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to cover her stomach with her arms, but it was too late. Mama's face twisted with rage. "You are pregnant!" Mama's voice rang out, sharp and loud. "In this house, you allowed yourself to carry Belle? You useless girl!" Tears welled in Happiness's eyes, but she couldn't speak. There were no words that could explain the shame and pain she carried inside her. "You think you'll come here and eat my food while you carry another man's bastard?" Mama shouted, her voice loud enough for the entire compound to hear. "So you want to disgrace me, eh? You want to ruin me?" The neighbors peeked out from their windows, drawn by the commotion. Mama stood at the entrance of the compound, hands on her hips, announcing her daughter's shame to the world. "This girl is carrying Belle, and she expects me to feed her over my dead body. She will not eat one morsel of food in this house, not while I live." "You are pregnant?" Mama's voice rang out sharp and loud. "In this house you allowed yourself to carry Belle? You useless girl!" Tears welled in Happiness's eyes, but she couldn't speak. There were no words that could explain the shame and pain she carried inside her. "You think you'll come here and eat my food while you carry another man's bastard?" Mama shouted, her voice loud enough for the entire compound to hear. "So you want to disgrace me, eh? You want to ruin me?" The neighbors peeked out from their windows, drawn by the commotion. Mama stood at the entrance of the compound, hands on her hips, announcing her daughter's shame to the world. "This girl is carrying Belle, and she expects me to feed her over my dead body. She will not eat one morsel of food in this house, not while I live." Happiness stood there, her hands trembling. She felt the weight of her mother's words like a slap to the face, each one slicing through her already wounded heart. To make things worse, Mama was also 4 months pregnant herself. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was a mother, carrying her own child, berating her daughter for doing the same. But in Mama's eyes, her pregnancy was legitimate. She was married after all. Happiness's pregnancy, on the other hand, was nothing but a disgrace. "You'll see," Mama continued, her voice shrill with anger. "You'll carry that bell with no food, and when you suffer enough, maybe you'll learn your lesson." From that day onward, Happiness's life became a daily struggle for survival. Mama made good on her threat, refusing to give her food. While her brothers ate their meals in silence, Happiness would sit in the corner, her stomach growling, her heart aching with shame. Sometimes, Emeka would sneak small portions of food to her, half a piece of yam, a few spoonfuls of rice, but it was never enough to fill the gnawing hunger that consumed her. The hunger wasn't just in her belly, it was in her soul. She hungered for love, for acceptance, for someone to see her not as a burden or a disgrace, but as a human being worthy of care. At night, when the hunger became unbearable, she would sit outside under the moon, talking to it as though it were her only friend. "Why me?" she whispered one night, her voice choked with tears. "What did I do to deserve this?" The moon, as always, gave no answers, but somehow in its silent glow, she found a small measure of comfort. As the weeks went by, something unexpected happened. Papa began to notice. He saw the way Mama refused to feed Happiness, how she scolded her at every turn, and how the girl's once bright spirit seemed to dim with each passing day. One evening after Mama had gone to bed, Papa sat beside Happiness on the wooden bench outside the house. The moonlight bathed them in silver, casting long shadows on the ground. "You're not alone, my daughter," Papa said quietly. "I see you. I see everything." Happiness looked at her father, her eyes filled with unshed tears. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her. "I don't know what the future holds," Papa continued, his voice gentle. "But whatever happens, you are still my daughter, and I will always love you." In that moment, under the quiet glow of the moon, Happiness felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she was not entirely alone in the world. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The shouting didn't end until Mama made up her mind. The pregnancy had to go. As the days passed, she couldn't bear the sight of her daughter's growing belly. Mama's anger turned to cold resolve. If Happiness wanted to ruin herself, she wouldn't allow the shame to stain the family's name. One morning, after breakfast, Mama grabbed Happiness by the arm. "You think I'll let you disgrace me with that belly?" she hissed. "No way. I'll pay for you to get rid of it, and you better thank me." Happiness followed silently, her body tense, knowing that any protest would only fuel Mama's rage. Her heart felt numb. In some ways, she was relieved. At least the burden inside her would be gone. But the way her mother spoke about her situation, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience, gnawed at her. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sadness. As they entered, Mama marched to the counter, her voice curt as she explained the situation to the nurse. Happiness stood by her side, her eyes downcast, feeling like a shadow of herself. They called her into a small room, where a doctor with tired eyes examined her. "How far along?" he asked without looking up from his notes. 3 months and 2 weeks, Mama answered, her arms crossed. "Just do it quickly." The doctor nodded, and without further conversation, they began the procedure. Happiness lay on the cold examination table, her body trembling. The pain was sharp and unbearable, as though her soul was being ripped from her. She clenched her fists, trying not to cry out, but tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, falling silently down her cheeks. When it was over, the doctor gave her instructions. "You need rest for at least a day," he said flatly. "Avoid heavy activities." But Mama, standing in the corner with her arms folded, snorted. "Rest?" she scoffed. "There's no time for that nonsense. Let's go." Happiness sat up slowly, her body weak and trembling. Blood trickled between her legs, but Mama ignored it. She paid the bill without a word and led her daughter out of the hospital. The moment they returned home, Mama thrust a tray of oranges into Happiness's hands. "Go," she ordered. You have to finish these before sunset. We don't have money to waste." Happiness blinked, her vision blurring from exhaustion and pain. "But, Mama, she whispered, her voice feeble. Mama's expression hardened. "What? You think you'll sit here all day after what you've done?" she snapped. "You're lucky I even spent money on you. Now go!" Tears welled in Happiness's eyes, but she nodded obediently. There was no point in arguing. She adjusted the tray on her head, wincing as pain shot through her lower abdomen. Blood soaked into the thin cloth she wore beneath her dress, but she didn't care. There was no room for pain or weakness in her world. The sun beat down mercilessly as Happiness trudged through the dusty streets, balancing the tray of oranges on her head. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she pressed on, her face a mask of numbness. The blood continued to flow, soaking her clothes, but she ignored it. She had learned long ago that no one cared about her suffering, not Mama, not the world. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to keep moving. With each orange she sold, she told herself it would be over soon. Just a few more, she thought, her vision swimming. Just a little longer. The customers didn't notice the blood or the pain etched on her face. To them, she was just another hawker, another nameless child trying to survive. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Happiness could barely stand. Her legs trembled violently and her vision blurred as exhaustion consumed her. But she kept moving, selling oranges until the tray was empty. When the last orange was gone, she let out a shaky breath. But as she turned to head home, her body finally gave out. Her knees buckled and she collapsed on the side of the road, the pain and exhaustion too much to bear. She lay there for a moment, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood pooled beneath her, but she didn't have the strength to move. For a fleeting moment, she considered staying there, letting the world forget her. It would be easier, wouldn't it? But then she thought of Emeka, her little brother, the one person who saw her, who cared about her. She couldn't leave him behind. With a deep breath, she forced herself to her feet. Every step was agony, but she walked, one painful step at a time, until she reached the house. When she got home, the house was quiet. Her brothers were already asleep, and Mama was nowhere to be seen. Happiness staggered into the small corner she called her own and collapsed onto the mat, her body screaming in protest. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry, not the silent, hidden tears she reserved for the moon, but deep, heart-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the baby she had lost, for the innocence that had been stolen from her, and for the love she had never received. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she lay there, staring at the ceiling, her heart as empty as the tray she had carried all day. The days that followed were a blur of pain and numbness. Mama continued to treat her with cold indifference, as if nothing had happened. But something inside Happiness had changed. The pain she had carried for so long had hardened into something else, determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she had survived. Against all odds, she was still standing. And as long as she was alive, she would keep going, not for herself, but for Emeka, for the flicker of love that still existed in her broken world. The days blurred together as Happiness tried to recover from the abortion, but life in the compound showed no mercy. The street demanded everything from each member of the family. Even Emeka, the quiet and observant one, wasn't spared. As the months passed, the financial pressure on the family deepened, and Emeka found himself struggling with a secret of his own. Emeka had always looked up to his sister, but he knew she could only do so much. He saw how Mama's anger consumed her, and how Papa's quiet presence wasn't enough to shield Happiness from the world's harshness. He didn't want to be a burden, and like the rest of his siblings, he knew that money was the only thing that could buy peace, or at least a small slice of it. So, when a group of older boys from his school cornered him one day, offering a way to make quick money, Emeka hesitated but listened. "You're smart, Emeka," one of them said, draping an arm over his shoulder. We see how you hustle. You know how things work. With us, you can make real cash, not this small money from selling water." Emeka knew what they were offering. The boys, led by a tall, sharp-eyed teen named Sunday, sold marijuana to students in and around the school. The idea of getting involved scared Emeka, but the thought of going home empty-handed, of watching happiness struggle day after day, scared him even more. "You don't even have to smoke it," Sunday continued, grinning. "Just sell it for us. You make your cut, no stress. Easy life, bro." Emeka tried to resist, but the older boys were relentless. They followed him after school, threatened him, and warned him that if he didn't cooperate, things would get rough, and Emeka knew they meant it. One Friday afternoon, Emeka found himself standing at the back of the school compound, his hands shaking as Sunday shoved a small packet into his palm. "Don't mess this up," Sunday warned, his tone light but his eyes cold. "Deliver it to that junior boy in 2B. He's expecting it after closing." Emeka nodded, stuffing the packet into his pocket. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to act normal. It felt like the walls of the school were closing in on him, the weight of what he was doing pressing down on his small shoulders. When school ended, he made the exchange quickly, his stomach knotting with guilt. The boy in 2B handed him a few crumpled naira notes, and Emeka shoved them deep into his pockets, feeling both ashamed and relieved. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but the money in his hand gave him a fleeting sense of power, something he rarely felt. At home, Happiness began to notice changes in Emeka. He was quieter than usual, often avoiding eye contact. Some days, he came home with extra money, which he claimed he got from helping a classmate with homework or running errands. Happiness knew better, but she didn't press him. She had her own secrets after all. But one evening, as they sat outside under the moon, she couldn't keep her concern to herself any longer. "Emeka," she whispered, "where is the money coming from?" Emeka shifted uncomfortably, tracing patterns in the dirt with his toe. "It's nothing," he mumbled, "just small jobs." Happiness reached out, gently turning his face toward hers. "Please don't lie to me," she said softly. "I know things are hard, but I need to know what's going on." For a moment, Emeka's resolve wavered. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the fear, the threats, and the guilt that gnawed at him, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't want to burden her any more than she already was. "I'm fine," he whispered instead. "Don't worry about me." Happiness studied him for a long moment, her heart aching with worry, but she knew better than to push too hard. In their world, secrets were as common as hunger, and sometimes they were the only thing that kept a person going. Weeks passed, and Emeka found himself deeper in the web spun by Sunday and the older boys. What started as small deliveries quickly turned into more dangerous tasks. Sunday began pressuring him to sell larger quantities and keep track of payments from other students. "You're in now, small boy," Sunday told him one day, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "If you try to back out, we'll make life very difficult for you, and for that sister of yours too." The mention of Happiness sent a chill through Emeka's spine. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He hated how these boys could so easily manipulate and threaten him. But more than anything, he hated the thought of them going after his sister. He couldn't let that happen. He had to keep going, no matter the cost. One rainy afternoon, Emeka came home soaked and exhausted, his pockets filled with dirty naira notes. As he stepped into the small room he shared with his siblings, Happiness noticed the tension in his shoulders and the haunted look in his eyes. "Emeka," she said softly, "whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." The pressure from Sunday and the older boys became unbearable. Every day felt like walking a tightrope between danger and survival, but Emeka was determined. He had to find a way out. He knew he couldn't rely on anyone to save him. If he waited too long, he'd be trapped forever in the dangerous web the boys had spun. One evening, after making his last delivery, Emeka made a decision. He handed Sunday the cash he had collected, then looked the older boy straight in the eye. "I'm done," Emeka said, trying to keep his voice steady, though fear curled in his chest. Sunday laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. You think you can just walk away? It doesn't work like that, small boy. But Emeka stood his ground, his heart pounding. I said I'm done, he repeated. He had learned enough to know that standing up to them was dangerous, but he also knew they wouldn't bother with someone who stopped making them money. He just needed to be firm and lucky. Sunday glared at him for a long moment, sizing him up. Then, with a sneer, he spat on the ground. You'll regret this, he muttered. But go, we don't need you. Emeka didn't wait for a second warning. He turned and walked away, each step lighter than the last. Fear still lingered, but so did relief. He had made it out. One night, as he sat with happiness under the moon, like they had so many times before, Is Mama really our mother? Emeka asked, his voice laced with doubt. Why do you ask? Happiness inquired, noticing the concern etched on Emeka's face. The way she treats us doesn't feel right, Emeka replied. I don't think a mother would treat her children the way she treats us. Happiness nodded thoughtfully. Papa told me she's our mother. He said she's building a house and that's why she's been putting pressure on us. He wants us to be patient so we can move into our new home soon. Emeka's expression turned determined. I don't think she realizes what she's doing is wrong, but someday, when I'm older, I'll make her understand her mistakes. One day, sister, we'll leave this place, he whispered. We'll have a better life. I'll make sure of it. Happiness smiled, her heart full of quiet pride. I know you will, Emeka, she whispered back, and I'll be right there with you. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories. Hey, before you go, why not check out my other story? See you next time and stay blessed.